Well, hey, welcome back to 316, a Bible study of Bridgeway Church out of Tampa, Florida. My name is Joel Eason. I get the privilege of serving at Bridgeway as the senior pastor, and on behalf of our church, welcome and thanks for being with us for this study. Now, if possibly you're new with us and you might be coming across our channel and you wonder why are we calling this 316, well, it really comes down to 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, and that's kind of been this driving verse for how we approach these studies that we have here on YouTube. We simply say and define and agree with the scripture that says that all scripture is God-breathed and it's useful, profitable for teaching, correcting, for rebuking, for training in righteousness, that we might be equipped, we might be able to follow the Lord. And so in this kind of a study, we like to go verse by verse in a variety of things. Now, we've done verse by verse over the past months and even past years with New Testament. What we're doing in this study is actually taking some summary, some snapshot views of Old Testament prophets, and to better maybe understand why the scriptures have the prophets in the way that they do, and then also to help us understand some of the New Testament things. And so if you missed our first installment of Samuel, hopefully you'll have a moment to be able to go back and listen to that. But we're going to go ahead and jump over as we're getting into tonight's study, where we're going to be looking at two particular guys. And one of the things that we say and have said from the beginning, that if we're going to study the prophets out of the Old Testament, it's helpful to understand that we've got to kind of correlate and pay attention to the kings that were leading Israel at the time, because as kings were leading and possibly leading poorly, very poorly, you'll see that tonight, that God would raise up prophets to be a voice. And following Samuel being the first of those prophets, then you jump into two guys by the name of Elijah and Elisha, and they end up being contemporaries, coming one right after the other. And we're going to kind of summarize some things tonight. You may know quite a bit of detail around them, but hopefully you'll be benefited from kind of this overview of them. Now, first we want to understand a couple of things, and that is when we're looking at the Old Testament, God uses Moses to lead Israel out of Egypt. He wants to be their God and be the one that they look to. And as they are led into the promised land by Joshua, they start to inhabit different lands according to tribes. There's an allotment that's given to each tribe. And if you just visualize over Israel, they're spread out, and you'll see a map tonight. And God establishes judges. Now, when we think of judges, we think of, a modern day version of a judge. That's probably not the best version of an Old Testament judge. An Old Testament judge was more of a military leader, somebody that took a stand against not only sin and wickedness, but against opposition from other kingdoms or other nations coming against Israel. And we're not going to study per se judges, but the people of Israel wanted a king. They desperately wanted a king. And Samuel is the one that finally is going to acquiesce. We talked about why last week, but in chapter 8, 1 Samuel, we read about Samuel's sons not following in the way of their father. So they are saying, give us a king, and the Lord is going to prompt Samuel to appease them. And so then it introduces the era of the monarchy or kings. And right alongside of that, as they sin, then you're going to have prophets that are raised up. Now, one thing before we move forward is to keep in mind that prophets weren't just about foretelling of the future. They were calling things out. They were like a megaphone of what is going wrong in the disposition or the volition, sinfulness of people and of the nation, and certainly of the kings. And but also foretelling what will happen. Here are the consequences that will come if we do not repent as a nation and as people of God. And so with that said, you have the first of the prophets being Samuel. Paul's going to identify in the book of Acts that Samuel was the first of these prophets. And he is going to serve in a very interesting way, and he's going to once again come alongside kings. So you're going to have the first king of Israel as being Saul, the second king of Israel is David, and Samuel's coming right alongside of those two kings. He is also going to serve as the last judge, and he's also going to serve as the high priest following Eli. And we dealt with that last week. Last thing that I will push on with Samuel is remembering that he is the one that establishes what's come to be defined as the school of prophets. That's important just to keep that little tidbit in your thinking tonight, because as we get into Elijah and Elisha, we will see this company or school of prophets come to the forefront again. So if we look once again, 1st and 2nd Samuel dealing with Saul and David. I said this last week, but 1st and 2nd Samuel used to be just one writing. In the Hebrew Bible, it was one writing. And it was actually you had 1st and 2nd Samuel being one writing, 1st and 2nd Kings being one writing, and they actually were seen as together as the writing of the kings. But then that got separated, and eventually based off of size, they got separated to 1st Samuel, 2nd Samuel, 1st Kings, and 2nd Kings. As we get into 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11, you're dealing with Solomon. Now, we're still under monarchy, Israel being led by one king. Not that Solomon was perfect, but still the attempt to devote to the Lord. He builds the temple and all that. And then we get into 1 Kings chapter 12, and you have the son of Solomon, Rehoboam, and you have this split in the kingdom. You're going to have what is the north kingdom, which should be called Israel. You're going to have the southern area, which is going to be called Judah. In just a moment, I'm going to give you a map, and I think all of this will be pretty easy to track with. But what follows Rehoboam is a succession of kings in both Israel, the north, and in Judah, down in the south. Now, where you see 0 and 20 and 8 and 20, so Israel would go on, the northern kingdom would go on to have about 20 kings, and none of them, 0. They threw up a goose egg. None of them would do well by the Lord. They would all be defined as doing wicked before the Lord. For Judah in the southern region, they ran at about 8 out of 20. Out of about 20 of their kings, 8 of them were identified as doing what pleased the Lord. 12 of them were wicked. So, once again, when you have kings like this leading and doing wickedly and leading a nation to serve other gods and worship other gods and condoning just all kinds of errant behavior, God raises up prophets to come alongside to call out and to foretell. Not just simply to foretell, but to call out and call people to repentance. Now, one of those kings, as you see here, 1 Kings chapter 12 through 16, leading up to 16, where we are tonight, you get to a guy by the name of Ahab. Ahab, king doing wicked, is going to be what sets the page for, or sets the table for Elijah to be raised up. So let's look at this. So it says here in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 29, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, he's the one we're going to focus on, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria. Just keep Samaria in mind. Samaria is up in the northern section. Israel's the northern kingdom, and Samaria is going to be like the capital of the northern area. And he's reigning over 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel. Now pause, because I'm going to come to something. So I want you to remember committing the sins of Jeroboam. Remember what I showed you about Rehoboam, son of Solomon, Rehoboam? Rehoboam and Jeroboam have a conflict about where Israel ought to go following Solomon's death. That's where the splitting of the kingdom goes. And if you were to, let's just say my fists are these two guys, one being Rehoboam and one being Jeroboam. Jeroboam goes northern kingdom, Rehoboam goes southern kingdom. And Jeroboam in the northern kingdom is going to do some things, something very specific, which I'll show you in just a second, that is wicked, that God defines as wicked, and Ahab and other kings continued to practice it. So I'll show it to you in just a moment what it is. But coming back to Jezebel, she's the daughter of Ithbaal, king of the Sidonians. And you'll remember Sidon. That's where Jezebel's coming from. And began to serve Baal and worship him. He, being Ahab, set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. So where he lived, Ahab, as king over the northern kingdom, establishes a temple in his homeland to Baal, not to God, but to Baal. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did all the kings of Israel before him. Now, if you just took everything at face value there, you would say, okay, that's the context in which God would raise up a prophet to say, this is wrong and judgment's coming if there's not forms of repentance. So with all that, that's why we come to 1 Kings chapter 17, and we have Elijah. Now Elijah, the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead, said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. There's going to be a whole sequence of things that are going to come following Elijah. Now here's where our summary comes into play. I'm going to show you a map here, and I don't want you to be in a rush to understand the map. This map is going to stay up for a good section of time because I'm going to overview Elijah and Elisha now with the map. So it's been that context that has come to this, right? So you have, if you look at this map, you'll see in the orange section, that's going to be some of the highlights of Elijah. In the green section, that's going to be some of the highlights of Elisha. And I'm going to talk you through the numbers in just a little bit. The first thing that I'd want to point to you is, do you see, you've got the blue parts, the bodies of water. You have the Mediterranean Sea. You have the Sea of Galilee up north, and then underneath the bigger body in the middle, which is the Dead Sea. Do you see the dashed line that goes across from the Dead Sea to the Mediterranean Sea? Where you have, following that dashed line, you have an N meaning north and an S meaning south. So that north section would have been Israel. That south section would have been Judah. Now where you see that pyramid, that triangle, that's going to represent where Jerusalem was, and that's where the temple was. You can see just already that the primary location of Elijah and Elisha is going to happen in the northern kingdom because of the wickedness that was happening up there. Now, I want to read to you what the sins of Jeroboam were. So we read this in 1 Kings chapter 12. It says, Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom, being his northern kingdom, will now likely revert to the house of David, coming down to the south because of the Temple of Solomon. And it says, if these people go up, being not so much think map, think geography or topography, Jerusalem was much higher than the valley area. So that's why it's saying going up, but it's actually coming south. It says, if these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to the Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. After seeking advice, the king, this is the sin, the king, being Jeroboam, made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. You shouldn't go up to Jerusalem. He said, here are your gods, these 2 golden calves. Now you remember the golden calf story of Moses' brother Aaron, and that God says this is unacceptable. Jeroboam does the same thing. He gives them 2 golden calves. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel, and the other in Dan, and this thing became a sin. The people went even as far as Dan to worship the one there. So when you look at that map, now let's look at the waters. You see the Dead Sea go just slightly north of the Dead Sea, and then look just a little west, you'll see Bethel. Now follow the Jordan River. The Jordan River is that line that goes from the Dead Sea straight up to the Sea of Galilee. Continue past the little body Sea of Galilee and you see Dan. That's the northern part of the northern kingdom. So Jeroboam establishes two different worship sites in Bethel, in the down southern part of the northern kingdom, and in the north part. And he says, this is where we're going to worship. And Ahab, as king of Israel, did not topple this. He perpetuated it and added even more pagan worship by having Baal worship. It's on that context that God says, okay, I'm going to raise up a prophet. And the first thing about Elijah is he's coming from Tishbe. So you see on our map here, you see the orange number 1. He's coming from Tishbe. And we're reading about this in 1 Kings chapter 17. You see, go more towards the middle, and you have the orange number 2, you have Samaria. That's where Ahab was. And Elijah's going to prophesy about a famine that's going to happen there. And it says in 1 Kings chapter 17, listen to this. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. So you see the Kerith ravine. You might see it in light blue. It might be hard to see on your screen, but just under Tishbe, there's a water line. That's the Kerith ravine. That's where he would have been. And it says, you will drink from the brook. I've ordered the ravens to feed you there. So he's going to stay there for a period of time. And then from that, where you see number 1 and number 3, he's going from 1 to 2, prophesying about the famine, to number 3, where the Kerith ravine is. Then he's going to go all the way over towards Mediterranean Sea. You see number 4, the orange number 4, Zarephath. And we read about this he's going to receive food in Zarephath. It says, sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I've commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. So this is going to cover, he's going to have this time period of about 3 years. Finally, in chapter 18, God is going to tell Elijah, it's time for you to go confront Ahab. So it says this in chapter 18, verse 1. After a long time, in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, go and present yourself to Ahab. Now, where would he have been? He had been towards Samaria. And it says, and I will send rain on the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. And what's going to happen is there's going to be this showdown. Elijah is going to tell Ahab, you bring all your priests and prophets for Baal and Asherah, and meet me at Mount Carmel. So you have Mount Carmel, which is number 5, and we read this in verse 19. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. And there's this massive, very famous showdown. I imagine you probably know about that. And the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah are trying to get this bull that's been selected to be consumed in fire. Nothing's happening. Finally, it comes Elijah's turn, and he says to pour water all over it. Just douse it, douse it, douse it, till this entire trench is filled with water. Elijah prays, and God sends fire upon this sacrifice, burns up the sacrifice. If you can see clearly where you have Mount Carmel, you'll have another little blue line, and that's the river Kishon, and that's where we read in chapter 18 that the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah are taken down to that river, and they are executed. They're killed down there. From that, Elijah is going to go back up on top of Mount Carmel. He's going to pray. And he's going to say, he's asking God to send the rain. And there's this real interesting dialogue about there not being any clouds and him sending a servant to go look. And he's looking out towards the Mediterranean Sea. And finally, this servant comes back and says, there's a cloud like the size of a man's hand. And Elijah announces that rain is coming. Now, immediately following this is where we get this real famous indictment or statement from Jezebel that she's going to call for Elijah to be killed. Elijah is going to be fearful. You've probably read the story several times. And he's going to flee. Now, where did he flee? If you look at the map, he's going to go from number 5 all the way down south into 6. Now, why is he going to go down south? Because that's southern territory where Ahab would not have sent his troops. Jezebel would not have sent any troops. He's going to go south toward Beersheba. At Beersheba, he's going to sit, and we read about this in chapter 19, he's going to sit underneath this palm tree and basically say, God, I want to die, you should kill me. He's going to fall asleep, angel's going to wake him up, he's going to say, you should eat this bread, drink this water. This is going to happen a couple times. Then he's going to continue down south. Do you see Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai at the very bottom of our map? He's going to go to Mount Horeb. Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai, where Moses was, same place, same mountains. It's defined with 2 different names, but it is the exact same mountain. And he is going to go all the way down there, and we're going to read about that exchange in 1 Kings chapter 19. And it's down there that God is going to give this very famous time that Elijah's in the cave. God's going to whisper to him, and the voice of the Lord wasn't in the fire, and it wasn't in the wind, and it wasn't in the earthquake, but it was in the whisper, and Elijah's going to hide from it. And we read this in verse 15. I'm in 1 Kings chapter 19 now, and we read in verse 15, the Lord said to him, go back the way you came, go to the desert of Damascus. Now pause, look at your map. Go all the way to the top of your map. Go back up to Damascus. He's sending him back with assignment. When you get there, anoint Hazael, king of Aram. So you see Aram up there. This is going to impact Elisha, the successor, king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nishmi, king over Israel, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Meholah. So look at, if you'll follow the Jordan River up, do you see orange number 7, Abel Meholah? That's where Elisha lived. So Elijah is going to leave Mount Horeb. He's going to travel up south. He's going to go to Abel Meholah, and that's where he's going to anoint Elisha. Now, there's a lot still that goes with Elijah that we're not covering, but I just want you to kind of see the general map that he followed. Now, one other thing with Elijah. He's going to have one more showdown that happens with Ahab, and it's often defined as Naboth's vineyard. We read about this in chapter 1. I will read one verse to you out of verse 17. Ahab is going to basically steal this vineyard from this gentleman by way of his wife, Jezebel, doing something very wicked that ends up costing the life of Naboth. And it says in verse 17, then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who rules in Samaria. He is now in Naboth's vineyard, where he has gone to take possession of it. And say to him, this is what the Lord says, have you not murdered a man and seized his property? Then say to him, this is what the Lord says, in the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood, yes, yours. And Ahab is going to be furious about this prophecy that comes to him. Following the exchange of chapter 21, we don't really hear about Elijah again until 2 Kings chapter 2. And in 2 Kings chapter 2, he is going to be, still following your map, he's going to be headed down south. He knows God's taken him home to heaven. And we have a very famous interaction between Elisha and Elijah. We're going to read those verses. Then I'm going to come back to the green, and we'll track with Elisha's life. So it says in 2 Kings chapter 2, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. You may remember those from the map. You'll see it in just a second again. Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel. So they go from Gilgal to Bethel. But Elisha said, and remember, Bethel was where that temple was that Jeroboam had set up. But Elisha said, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel. The company of prophets. Remember, the school of prophets was established by Samuel, but now they've populated in lots of different areas. It's what allows for this continuance of the prophets. The company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," Elisha replied, "but do not speak of it." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, Elisha, being in Bethel. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went to Jericho. And you probably remember that from your map already. 50 men of the company of prophets went and stood at a distance facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. Now they've gone from Jericho to the Jordan River. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, struck the water with it. The water divided to the right, to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. When they crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I can do for you before I'm taken from you." And here's Elisha's request. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. And then there's this famous taking of Elijah. Now you see that last orange, it says Elijah's hill. There's a place there called Tel Mar Elias. And it's a hill that many people think that was the hill that Elijah was taken. It's tradition. Is it factual? Could be, maybe not. Don't know, but we do know it was on the east side of the Jordan River. They had gone from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho, across the Jordan River to some hill there, and God comes by chariot. Very famous story. By chariot, angels come by chariot and take Elijah to heaven. So that introduces the ministry now of Elisha, because many people define the numbers around Elijah's miracles as being either 7, 8, or up to 14. And the reason for the variance is, do you count in the miracles prophecies that were later fulfilled? If so, the number gets higher. If not, the number is lower. Either way you do that, the number of miracles for Elisha ends up being double for what you would see from Elijah's ministry. And so the first thing for Elisha is he's going to come back across the Jordan River. And now we start to see the greens, right? Green number one, first thing that we read about in 2 Kings chapter 2 is he's going to go to Jericho. There's water that's tainted. There's going to be a miracle that's going to happen there. And then, or you saw one. Then you see number two. If I can just give you the capsule of this, Samaria, where Ahab had been, Ahab's son begins to take over. And Ahab's son comes down south towards Judah with Jehoshaphat. If you've ever heard King Jehoshaphat, the very famous out of Chronicles chapter 20, 1 Chronicles chapter 20, that would be Jehoshaphat. They're going to come together down to the king of Edom to go make war against the Moabites. Elisha is going to end up having to help them. There's going to be a miracle of water, and there's going to be a prophecy from that. From that, then, and I'll just read a quick verse to you there real quick out of chapter 3, 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 8. It says this, "By what route shall we attack?" He asked, "Through the desert of Edom." The king of Israel set out with the king of Judah. King of Judah would have been Jehoshaphat, and the king of Edom. After a roundabout march of 7 days, the army had no water for themselves or for the animals. "What," exclaimed the king of Israel, "has the Lord called us 3 kings together only to hand us over to Moab?" But Jehoshaphat asked, "Is there no prophet of the Lord here, that we may inquire of the Lord through him?" An officer of the king of Israel answered, Elisha, son of Shaphat, is here. He used to pour water on the hands of Elijah. And that's where Elijah is going to help them. From that, then you see number 4, or number 3, I mean, he's going to go up towards Bethel. He's going to help a widow who is in debt, and there's going to be a miracle of oil for this lady. You can read about that in chapter 4, 2 Kings chapter 4. And then there's this real interesting thing. He's going to go up towards do you see the green 4 up in the middle? Shunem. There's a Shunammite woman who aids Elisha, provides food for him. She is barren. Elisha is going to basically prophesy over her that she'll have a child. She does have a child, and then that child is going to be in danger, is going to be in danger of dying, and is actually going to need to be resurrected. I want to read this verse to you. Um, um, Elisha had moved away from Shunem over to Mount Carmel, and he gets word that the Shunammite lady's son is sick or is in peril. And it says in verse 24, she, being this Shunammite woman, she saddled the donkey and said to her servant, "Lead on, don't slow down for me unless I tell you." So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. She gets him there. He's going to go to Shunem, and there's going to be this miracle. It's where Elisha lays down on the kid and ends up bringing this kid back to life. It's a real dramatic miracle. And then you go across to number 5, and that's where you see the green number 5. That's where the story of Naaman. And we read about Naaman in chapter 5. It says, "Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram." You remember Aram up there top. "He was a great man in the sight of his master, highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy." And there's going to be this miracle that happens where Elisha tells him to go dip in the Jordan River. And you can see where this would have happened. In verse 10 it says, or verse 11, "Naaman went away angry after he'd been told to go dip in the Jordan. I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, I don't know how you say that, the rivers of Damascus," you see Damascus up there, "better than any of the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. And then he's going to be advised, you go do what the prophet said, and he's going to go dip in the Jordan River, and he's going to be healed. I'm just wanting you to see the map of this. And then that's going to go take him down to Dothan. You see green number 6. And there's going to be an interaction with another set of enemies. The Arameans, are going to make war against Israel. Elisha is going to be helping them. And you can read about it in chapter 6. This is where that famous story of Elisha putting his hand on his protege, on his assistant, and saying, "Let him be able to see with the eyes of the Spirit." Basically, they're more with us than are against us, because the apprentice was incredibly scared, and this apprentice sees the armies of heaven there ready to defend Elisha and the army of Israel in that northern section. That happens in chapter 6. I'll just read it. I'll take the liberty of reading it here. In chapter 8, or we read about it in chapter 6, verses 8 through 14. And it says, "When the servant of the man of God got up and went out early in the next morning, the army of the horses and chariots had surrounded the city. 'Oh, my Lord, what shall we do?' The servant asked. 'Don't be afraid,' the prophet answered. 'Those who are with us are more than those who are with them.' And Elisha prayed, 'O Lord, open his eyes so he may see.' Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around him." And that happens there in Dothan. Interestingly enough, Dothan is also the place right by Shechem in which Joseph was betrayed by his brothers. Now, just a couple last things is you have number 7 over by Ramoth Gilead. That's where Jehu is going to be anointed as king, and that's in fulfillment. Do you remember what Elisha prophesied or was told by God to anoint Jehu as king? It's going to happen there in chapter 9, 2 Kings chapter 9, and you can read about it in verse 1 through 3. And then the last thing is another famous thing that happens up towards 8. You see Damascus and Aram. You remember in the Old Testament this famous story about a prophet who's ill, who's about to die, and a king who shoots this arrow and then strikes the arrow 3 times. That's Elisha dealing with Aram. I'll read it. It'll be the last passage that I'm reading here for you. In chapter 13, it tells us that Elisha is ill And it says in verse 14, now Elisha was suffering from the illness from which he died. Jehoash, king of Israel, went down to see him, wept over him. My father, he cried, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. Elisha's going to give him instruction, shoot the arrow out, beat the arrow on the ground. And it says this in verse 18, then he said, take the arrows, and the king took them. Elisha said, strike the ground. He struck it 3 times and stopped. The man of God was angry with him and said, you should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times, then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed it, but now you'll defeat it only 3 times. So there are a number of other miracles that happen and prophecies that happen with Elisha, but I wanted you to see the context of the map that Elijah and Elisha are so strongly connected with Israel northern section. Why? Because the wickedness of kings. And God is working miracles, and he's pointing out, and he's foretelling, and he's saying things have got to change. Now, we see Elijah showing up in the New Testament. I'm going to start bringing this towards Jesus and then wrap it up. We read in Malachi chapter 4, see, I'll send the prophet Elijah before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He's talking about how he's going to turn the hearts of people, fathers to children and hearts of children to fathers. And then in John chapter 1, the people are asking John the Baptist, are you Elijah? You look at that bottom part. They asked him if he was the Christ. He said, I'm not the Christ. Then they asked him, are you Elijah? And he said, I'm not. Only to later read when Jesus is on the Mount Tabor and the Mount of Transfiguration with the disciples, and the disciples are saying, why did the teacher say that Elijah has to come first? And Jesus said this, to be sure Elijah comes and will restore all things, but I tell you, Elijah's already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. Now, I'm going to land the plane here in just 1 second. What does Elijah mean, and what does Elisha mean? Elijah, the name of Elijah means the Lord is God. Elisha, the name of Elisha means my God is salvation. The whole reason that God is raising up these men in succession with one another in the midst of all that was going errant with the kings is reminding the people that Jehovah, he's God. Not their northern kingdom, not their southern kingdom, not their traditions, not their armies, not their wealth, not their this, not their that. The Lord is God. One of the things Elijah continues to beat that drum is the Lord is God. Not Baal, not Asherah, not your kingdom, not any of this. The Lord is God. Why does God bring John the Baptist before Jesus? To point people to the Lord is God. Not your tradition, not Judaism, not your any other thing that you could supplant the honor and the glory of God with. The Lord is God. What follows that? My God is salvation. And so Elisha came with a message that my God is salvation, both to the north, to the south. Remember, he helped Jehoshaphat down in the south and even Edom, other nations. He also has things that pertaining to the Arameans. It just is a picture of Elijah, the Lord is God, and Elisha, my God is salvation, all setting the theme. Both of those messages setting the theme for what the other prophets would come to say. The kings that would do wickedly, and Isaiah that would come, Jeremiah that would come, the prophets that would come, speaking about the Lord is God, and he is salvation. And we see that ultimately fulfilled in Jesus, that the Lord is God and he is our salvation. And that is just kind of a quick overview, maybe a 30 plus minute, I'm not sure how long I've gone, overview of Elijah, the map that he covers, Elisha, the map that he covers, how they kind of run hand in hand with one another, their names, the meaning, and all pointing to the fact of the Lord is God and he is our salvation. And I hope and pray that you know in your life, he is the Lord and He is our salvation, and we can always look to Him. I hope this has been a blessing to you. I hope you'll take the study even further than we've had time to take it, and I hope you'll join us for our next one, as now we start to look at the major prophets. We'll look first at Isaiah, then Jeremiah, then Ezekiel, and then Daniel. And with that, I pray that the Lord blesses you and keeps you, and that you have an amazing time till we're together again. God bless you. I'll see you soon.